Your silence is doing what months of conversations, explanations, and emotional appeals couldn't accomplish. The avoidant is finally seeing their patterns reflected back at them through the stark absence of your voice. When you are talking, explaining, pursuing, and trying to make them understand, they could dismiss your words as neediness, oversensitivity, or drama. But silence is undeniable. It creates a mirror that forces the avoidant to confront their behavior without the distraction of managing your reactions or deflecting your concerns. In the space your silence creates, the avoidance patterns become visible in ways they've never been before. The withdrawal they normalized is revealed as abandonment. The emotional unavailability they justified is exposed as cruelty. The inconsistency they rationalized is shown as manipulation. Your silence isn't punishment, though the avoidant might experience it that way initially and project blame onto you. It's the natural consequence of their patterns meeting someone who finally stopped absorbing the impact and chose self-protection instead. The avoidant is being forced to sit with their choices without your presence buffering them from the harsh reality of what they've done. This confrontation with their own toxicity is uncomfortable, disorienting, and potentially transformative if they're capable of using it for growth. Understanding what your silence triggers in the avoidant helps you recognize the power of stepping back and letting their patterns speak for themselves, rather than continuing to speak over them with your own pain and protest. The echo chamber effect. When you were present and responsive, the avoidance behavior disappeared into the noise of your reactions. Your pursuit after their withdrawal created enough drama that they never had to examine why they withdrew in the first place. Your anxiety about their distance generated enough activity that they never had to feel the emptiness their distance created. Your explanations of how they hurt you provided content that distracted from the actual hurting. But your silence eliminates all that noise. Now when the avoidant withdraws, there's no pursuit to validate the withdrawal as necessary. When they're distant, there's no anxiety reaching across the gap to fill it. Subscribe for psychology insights that help you understand what happens when you stop participating in dynamics that never served you. The avoidant is left alone with their patterns, and in that aloneness, the patterns echo back at them with a clarity that's impossible to ignore. The echo chamber effect means the avoidant is finally experiencing their own behavior as behavior rather than as justified response to your neediness. They withdraw, and there's just silence. Not hurt silence designed to manipulate them back, but genuine absence of your energy from their space. They're cold and there's no warmth reaching out to them trying to thaw the ice. There's just cold, meeting more cold, which reveals the cold was always coming from them. The avoidant realizes their patterns aren't protective responses to overwhelming partners. They're choices that create the very isolation they claim to need. This realization is profoundly uncomfortable because it removes their primary justification for their behavior and forces them to confront what they're actually doing. The echo also includes the avoidant hearing their own excuses without your voice to argue against them. When they tell themselves they need space, there's no one pushing back to prove they're just avoiding. When they rationalize their distance as healthy boundaries, there's no one pointing out, these aren't boundaries but walls. The avoidant's internal narratives play out without external challenge. and in playing out, they start to sound hollow even to the avoidant. The excuses that felt compelling when they were used to deflect your concerns feel weak when they're only convincing the avoidant themselves. Your silence forces them to be both the one making excuses and the one hearing them, and this dual position reveals how flimsy their justifications actually are when examined without the distraction of managing your reactions to them. The behavior pattern visibility. Your silence creates contrast that makes the avoidance patterns visible in ways they've never been. When you were constantly present, there was no before and after. There was just the ongoing dynamic where things were always somewhat difficult, where you were always somewhat unhappy, where the relationship was always somewhat unstable. The avoidant could tell themselves this is just how relationships are, that all connections require managing other people's emotions. That distance is a natural part of intimacy. But your silence creates a clear demarcation. There was the time when you were engaged, and now there's the time of your absence. This contrast forces the avoidant to see that something changed. And the only thing that changed was their accumulated patterns finally leading to consequence. The visibility includes the avoidant recognizing frequency and intensity of their problematic behavior. When you were responding to each instance, the instances blurred together into general relationship difficulty. But silence allows the avoidant to count. How many times did they withdraw? How often did they cancel plans? How frequently did they prioritize everything else over the relationship? The patterns that felt scattered and occasional when buffered by your constant engagement are revealed as systematic and chronic when viewed through the lens of accumulated impact. Your silence is the result of hundreds of small abandonments, and in your absence, the avoidant is finally adding them up. The pattern visibility also forces the avoidant to see themselves as others see them. When you were there trying to make things work, the avoidant could maintain the belief that they're a fundamentally good person who just needs a lot of space. But your silence suggests something else entirely. It suggests that their behavior was bad enough that someone who cared about them chose to completely remove themselves rather than continue engaging. This perspective shift is jarring. The avoidant is confronting that they might be the problem, that their patterns might be toxic rather than just protective, that they might have damaged something valuable through their repeated choices to prioritize their comfort over someone else's legitimate needs. The consequence recognition awakening. For possibly the first time, the avoidant is experiencing real consequences for their patterns. In past relationships, or earlier in this one, the consequences were abstract. People would be hurt, but they'd stay. People would be frustrated, but they'd keep trying. The avoidant learned that their patterns might create temporary difficulties, but never permanent loss. But your silence represents permanent loss in progress. The avoidant is watching the relationship end not because of a dramatic fight or betrayal, but because their accumulated patterns finally eroded your investment to the point of complete withdrawal. This consequence is undeniable and confronting. The awakening includes the avoidant recognizing they don't have the power to fix this with their usual strategies. They can't withdraw further because you've already withdrawn completely. They can't breadcrumb you back because you're not responding to breadcrumbs. They can't promise change to restore the status quo because the silence indicates the status quo has been permanently rejected. The avoidance toolkit for managing relationships without actually changing has become completely ineffective. For perhaps the first time, they're facing the reality that their patterns have destroyed something they might have wanted to keep, and no amount of manipulation or minimal effort will restore it. The consequence recognition also includes the avoidant understanding that this outcome was predictable and avoidable. They can trace the line from their patterns to your silence and see the clear causality. They withdrew repeatedly, so you stopped reaching out. They were consistently unavailable, so you stopped being available to them. They treated the relationship as optional, so you opted out. The consequences aren't random or unfair. They're the natural result of treating someone poorly enough for long enough that they finally protect themselves by leaving. This recognition is painful because it means the avoidant can't blame circumstances, bad luck, or your inadequacy. They chose this outcome through accumulated choices to prioritize their patterns over the relationship. The isolation reality confrontation. Your silence forces the avoidant to sit in the isolation their patterns created. When you were present, the avoidant could maintain the belief that they were choosing healthy solitude, that their distance was intentional and comfortable, that they preferred being alone. But your absence reveals that their isolation isn't chosen solitude at all. It's the natural consequence of pushing away everyone who tries to get close. The avoidant is alone, not because they prefer it, but because their patterns make sustainable connection impossible. This confrontation with the difference between chosen independence and consequence-driven isolation is deeply unsettling and forces honest self-examination. The isolation reality includes the avoidant noticing how empty their life feels without your presence. They thought they wanted space, but space without the option of connection feels completely different from space with someone waiting in the wings. The avoidant is experiencing the difference between having someone to keep at arm's length and having no one at all. The arm's length distance they maintained felt comfortable when you were still there to be distant from. But actual absence, actual loss of access to you, reveals that the distance was only comfortable because it wasn't permanent. True isolation, the kind your silence represents, is unbearable. The confrontation also includes the avoidant recognizing patterns of loss in their history. Your silence isn't the first time someone has removed themselves from the avoidant's life because of their patterns. It's just the most recent and perhaps most impactful instance. The avoidant starts seeing the trail of lost relationships behind them, the pattern of people who cared about them choosing to leave rather than continue being hurt by their repeated withdrawal and emotional unavailability. This historical pattern was invisible when they could blame each individual person for being too needy or not understanding them. But your silence, combined with all the other silences before it, reveals a consistent pattern where the avoidant is always the common factor in these endings. They can no longer avoid recognizing that they're the one creating the isolation they claim to want but actually fear deeply. The empathy activation through absence. Your silence is forcing the avoidant to imagine what you're feeling and experiencing in ways your presence never could. When you were there expressing hurt, the avoidant could minimize your feelings because you were right in front of them, still trying. But your absence requires them to imagine your experience, and imagination is often more powerful than reality. the avoidant finds themselves wondering what you're feeling, whether you're okay, whether you've moved on, whether you're hurting or healing. This wondering is a form of empathy activation that the avoidant's defenses usually prevent. The empathy activation includes the avoidant recognizing how much they hurt you. When you were explaining your pain, they could dismiss it as overdramatic or manipulative. But now that you're silent, the avoidant has to acknowledge that you were hurt badly enough to completely disengage. The silence proves the hurt was real and significant. The avoidant cannot minimize or deny pain that led someone to remove themselves entirely. This recognition forces them to sit with the impact of their behavior in ways they've avoided throughout the relationship. They caused enough damage that you chose silence over continued engagement, and that reality is heavy. The empathy through absence also means the avoidant is experiencing a fraction of what you experienced throughout the relationship. They're feeling the anxiety of not knowing where someone stands. They're experiencing the pain of reaching out and getting nothing back. They're sitting with the uncertainty of whether someone cares about them or has moved on entirely. These are the feelings the avoidant inflicted on you repeatedly through their patterns of withdrawal and distance. Now they're on the receiving end, and the experience is teaching them about impact in ways all your explanations couldn't. The avoidant is learning through direct experience what it feels like to be in relationship with an avoidant, and the lesson is brutal. The narrative collapse under silence. The stories the avoidant told themselves about the relationship are falling apart in your silence. They told themselves you were too needy, but your silence proves you're capable of radical independence. They told themselves you were clingy, but your complete withdrawal shows you can let go absolutely. They told themselves you were the problem, but your absence reveals that the problems were relational patterns they participated in and perpetuated. Every narrative the avoidant constructed to justify their behavior is being disproven by your silence, and this collapse is forcing them to confront reality without the comfort of their defensive stories. The narrative collapse includes the avoidant recognizing they wanted you more than they admitted. They told themselves they could take you or leave you, that your presence wasn't particularly important, that they were fine either way. But the feeling of actual loss contradicts this story. The avoidant realizes they assumed you'd always be available, that they were taking your presence for granted, that they did actually want you in their life. The wanting becomes visible only in the absence, and this visibility forces the avoidant to acknowledge they've been lying to themselves about what they needed and wanted from the relationship. The collapse also means the avoidant can no longer blame you for the relationship's difficulties. When you were present and reactive, they could point to your reactions as evidence that you were the source of conflict. But your silence removes you as a variable. Now, there's just the avoidant and the absence where the relationship used to be. They cannot blame your neediness for the loss because you're not needing anything from them. They cannot blame your reactions for the conflict because there are no reactions. The avoidant is left with only their own patterns and the consequences of those patterns, and this clarity forces them to take ownership they've avoided throughout the relationship. The change motivation emergency. Your silence is creating a crisis that might finally motivate real change in the avoidance patterns. The avoidant has operated for years or decades without significant consequences for their patterns. People stayed despite being hurt. Relationships limped along despite being fundamentally dysfunctional. The avoidant learned that they could continue their patterns indefinitely because others would absorb the cost and continue trying. But your silence signals that this dynamic has ended. The cost is now falling on the avoidant in the form of complete loss, and loss is the only motivator powerful enough to cut through avoidant defenses and create genuine urgency for transformation. The emergency motivation includes the avoidant finally considering that they might need to change fundamentally rather than just manage others' reactions to their patterns. When you were present, the avoidant could make small adjustments to reduce your complaints without changing their core patterns. They could temporarily increase communication or be slightly more available to calm you down, then return to their baseline patterns. But your silence indicates that small adjustments won't work anymore. The avoidant is confronting that they need to actually examine their attachment patterns, do therapeutic work on their wounds, and develop completely new ways of being in relationship. This level of change is terrifying and overwhelming, but it's also the only path forward if the avoidant wants different outcomes in future relationships or any hope of repairing this one. The motivation emergency also includes the avoidant recognizing they're running out of time and opportunities. They've cycled through relationships or pushed away the same person repeatedly, and each repetition has made the pattern more entrenched and the consequences more severe. Your silence might be the final wake-up call before the avoidant loses their capacity for connection entirely. They're at a crossroads where they either do the deep work to change or accept that they'll live out their life in the isolation their patterns create. This existential recognition creates urgency that might finally overcome the avoidance resistance to growth and vulnerability. The emergency is real because the alternative to change is permanent aloneness. The responsibility ownership pressure. Your silence creates pressure for the avoidant to take responsibility because there's no one else to blame anymore. When you were engaged, the avoidant could construct shared responsibility narratives where you both contributed to problems. But your absence eliminates the both. There's just the avoidant and the patterns that led to your leaving. The pressure to own their behavior becomes overwhelming because every attempt to deflect responsibility hits the wall of your silence. You're not there to accept partial blame, to acknowledge your role in dynamics, to let the avoidant off the hook by sharing culpability. The responsibility sits entirely with them now. The ownership pressure includes the avoidant confronting specific behaviors they can no longer deny or minimize. They withdrew repeatedly. They were emotionally unavailable. They prioritized their patterns over the relationship. They hurt you through accumulated small abandonments that added up to something unbearable. These facts are undeniable because your silence is the proof. The avoidant cannot revise history or reframe their choices when the outcomes speak so clearly about what those choices created. They're being forced to acknowledge exactly what they did and exactly what it cost. And this acknowledgement is the foundation of any real change or growth. The pressure also means the avoidant has to decide what kind of person they want to be going forward. They can accept responsibility, do the work to change, and become someone capable of healthier relationships. Or they can defend their patterns, maintain their justifications, and accept that they'll continue losing people they care about. Your silence has created a decision point where the avoidant must choose between growth and stagnation, between owning their impact and continuing to avoid it. The pressure of this choice is intense precisely because your silence has made the consequences of their patterns undeniable and the cost of not changing absolutely clear. They can no longer hide from what they've done or what it means about who they are.